building a car for the astronauts to drive on the moon. This was very different from driving here on Earth. Just getting to the moon was hard enough, and they could only get so far on foot. So they built a vehicle, made it lightweight and foldable, and then carefully landed it on the moon. And they did it successfully 3 times. Let's take a look at the Lunar Roving vehicle, how it was stored, driving it on the moon, and of course the entire unfolding process and how they set it up. But let's start our story at the very beginning. The idea of driving on the moon wasn't new. Science fiction writers had imagined lunar vehicles as far back as the early 1900s, and later, engineers came up with their own designs. In the 1960s, NASA started planning to actually build one of these vehicles. To understand how challenging this was, we need some background. NASA explored the moon with the Apollo program. They landed astronauts on the moon for the first time in 1969. In fact, they did it 6 times over 3.5 years. Each mission launched on this rocket. It's called the Saturn V. Up at the top is the Apollo spacecraft, which includes the Command and Service Module and the Lunar Module, sometimes called the LEM. The Saturn V launches into space using multiple rocket stages. There's a little rearranging to get the LEM out, and the Apollo spacecraft takes about 3 days to get to the moon. Then the spacecraft separates, and the LEM is the only part that actually lands on the surface. On the first 2 moon landings, they stayed relatively close to the lander. For example, let's look at Apollo 12, the second moon landing. If we map out their walking routes, they only reached a few hundred meters in any direction. This is only as far as about a few city blocks. And wherever they went, they had to carry equipment by hand. If you remember, Apollo 13 had an accident in space and didn't actually land on the moon. So the third moon landing was Apollo 14, and they tried something different. They brought along a hand-pulled cart called the Modular Equipment Transporter. Astronauts nicknamed it the rickshaw. Its 2 wheels were made of smooth rubber with an inner nitrogen tube. It was helpful in carrying more equipment, but dragging it over rocks and craters was still difficult, slow, and tiring. When they went outside in their spacesuits, they only had a few hours. That's not enough time to walk very far. If they had some sort of car or vehicle, they could travel much farther. NASA understood this early on and started planning and researching. Many of the early concepts were big and heavy. This one was called MoLab, short for Mobile Laboratory. It was practically the size of a small truck. It was so heavy that it would have required launching an extra Saturn V rocket. But due to NASA's budget, we had a limited number of rockets, so this was not an option. The lunar module was the only thing landing on the moon. So if they were to send a vehicle, it would somehow have to fit inside. Not an easy task. There was a lot more researching and designing. The rover had to be lightweight and be able to fold up to fit inside the LEM. NASA contracted out to 2 companies to actually build the rover. They started building it just a few months after Apollo 11, and it was done just in time for Apollo 15. That's only 17 months to complete the first rover. But how did they fit it inside the lunar module? We'll get to that, but let me first share a few facts about the rover. The full name is the Lunar Roving Vehicle, sometimes called the Lunar Rover, LRV, or Moon Buggy. They built 4 rovers in total, but only 3 of them were flown, on Apollo 15, 16, and 17. The 4th was used for spare parts and is now on display at Kennedy Space Center in Florida. Altogether, these rovers cost $38 million. That's nearly $300 million in today's dollars. The rover is about as big as a regular car, about 3 meters in length. However, it only weighs as much as a large motorcycle here on Earth. The moon has a lot less gravity. The mass will be the same, but it will weigh a lot less, light enough that they can pick it up by hand if they needed to. Here's the main parts of the lunar rover. The chassis, which is the frame of the vehicle, the 4 wheels, 2 seats, display console and hand controller for driving, a color TV camera that controlled this from back on Earth, antennas and equipment for communications so they could talk with mission control, and the aft chassis pallet, which stored a lot of tools. Some of these components were wrapped in mylar, which looks like gold tinfoil. This helped protect the delicate equipment. They would often lift the flaps when the rover wasn't moving. This would help prevent overheating. If they would have tried to drive the lunar rover on Earth, it would have collapsed under its own weight. Maybe not exactly like this, but you get the idea. It was built specifically for the low gravity of the moon. They did, however, build a test vehicle that they could drive on Earth, made from much stronger and heavier materials. The actual rover was built from lightweight aluminum. and it could support more than twice its own weight on the moon. This includes 2 astronauts, science equipment, and moon rocks they would bring back home. The wheels were one of the rover's most clever features. Rubber tires would have been too much of a risk. If punctured, it could have stranded the astronauts far away from their spacecraft. So instead, each wheel has a woven steel wire mesh with titanium chevron treads to prevent sinking into the lunar dust. The wheels were prepared to handle obstacles as high as 25 centimeters if they needed to. The stiff inner frame kept the mesh from deforming too much. Each wheel had its own independent electric motor. This way, if one of them failed, they would still be able to drive the rover. The wheels had fenders to control the lunar dust. Astronauts sometimes described it like powdered snow, but the static electricity made it cling to everything, and once it sticks, it's incredibly hard to remove. The lunar rover could travel a top speed of 18 kilometers per hour. Turning to the left or right involved all 4 wheels. This was all done with the hand controller in the middle. Push to go forward, side to steer, and pull back to stop. To reverse, they would come down here and flip this switch up. After that, pulling back on the hand controller would reverse the vehicle. The hand controller would send electric signals down to the mechanical parts, which would then cause the wheels to rotate. The power came from 2 silver zinc batteries, enough for up to 65 kilometers of driving. For safety, each rover trip began by driving out to the farthest point they planned to explore, and then slowly make their way back. I like to think of this like a circle that slowly shrinks as the day goes on. They always have to stay inside this. If the rover broke down, the astronauts could still walk back to the lunar module with enough life support to make it safely. That means the farthest distance they could travel was about 9.5 kilometers away from the LEM. Driving on the moon felt completely different. There's a lot less gravity here. And it took some time for them to get used to it. It was harder to stop quickly or change direction. Apollo 15, 16, and 17 were considered extended scientific missions. They would stay longer, travel farther, and do more experiments than the previous missions. And they would do it in style. They, of course, did have a few problems. For Apollo 15, they landed on a rim of a small crater, making it more difficult to deploy the rover when everything was tilted. Then the front steering didn't work at first. Luckily, they could still use the wheels in the back to steer the rover. Then on the last mission, one of the astronauts' tools snagged on part of the fender and broke it off, and they had to get creative to fix it. Otherwise, it would have sprayed lunar dust all over the vehicle. Overall, the lunar rover was a tremendous success. It allowed them to cover more ground and see some incredible views. There was more time actually doing science. Even today, these rock samples are still being studied at NASA and other universities around the world. On the first moon landing, this is how far they walked. Then on the last mission, this is how far they drove, a total of 36 kilometers. So how did the lunar rover fit inside the lunar module? A few years ago, I made a video about the LEM. Let me show you a few pieces here. There are 2 parts. The ascent stage, this is where the 2 astronauts live, and it's the only part that launches back into space at the end of their stay on the moon. The descent stage is what we'll be looking at in this video. It's what was used to land on the moon. It has the engine and the fuel and oxidizer tanks. There are 4 triangle areas. This is where most of the equipment was stored. Things like water, oxygen, science experiments, and even a TV camera. They call these areas quadrants, so we have quadrants 1, 2, 3, and 4. The lunar roving vehicle was stored right here in quadrant 1. This was kind of the leftover space in the LEM, really the only place they could put it. The rover was folded up and placed inside of this triangular bay. The rover was attached to this space support equipment. This would help unfold the rover on the moon. The available volume here is about 1 cubic meter. That's about the size of a refrigerator. Unfolding the rover was a complicated process. Before I show you that, let's talk about some of the information that the lunar rover sent back to Earth, like where the rover is and how fast it's moving. This is data that the entire world can see, and that's okay. However, you personally have data that you probably don't want to share, like your home address, phone number, or financial data. This is why I'm excited to share today's sponsor, Incogni. This is an online service that helps you remove your personal information from the internet. This drastically reduces the risk of being scammed or impersonated, also helping you to reduce unwanted spam in your email inbox. You've seen the news stories like this, and it's not fun to think about. Years ago, I found it a little scary when I searched my own name, and it displayed a lot of my personal information. With Incogni, they send removal requests to each website, which saves you the hassle of doing it yourself. Who knows how much time that would take? And if there's a website that they didn't catch, you can submit it for a custom removal, and Incogni will take care of it for you. The online dashboard lets you see the entire process, which keeps you in control. Take back your personal data with Incogni. Use code JaredOwen at the link below and get 60% off an annual plan. Before they unfolded the Lunar Rover, they had to get some things ready. This part of the LEM is called the porch. As the commander crawled out backwards, he would reach out to the left side and pull a D handle. This lowers MESA, Modular Equipment Stowage Assembly. This contains a few parts that will be installed on the rover. Once both astronauts are on the surface, it's finally time to deploy the rover. On Apollo 15, the first time they used the rover, they set up a camera right here. This is how we got the actual footage of this happening. From start to finish, it took about 20 minutes. Let's walk through this step by step. On the bottom of the lunar rover, there was a thermal cover. This was rolled back by the astronauts. Then there were two straps, or operating tapes. These were used to control the unfolding process. One astronaut held the right strap, while the other one climbed the ladder again. He pulled a D handle on the right side of the porch. When this was pulled, it moved a complex system of levers, which released 3 pins. Let's zoom in to get a close-up view. When the pins are released, securing latches fell to the ground, and the rover could begin rotating outwards. To start this process, there was a spring-loaded push rod at the very top. The rover started rotating, but not by very much. The astronaut on the right side slowly pulled the operating tape. This rotated a storage drum that released more of the 2 guide cables. The other astronaut held the deployment cable, which helped pull the rover out along with the moon's gravity. Part of the way through, though, the pivot point shifted to the lower support arm. Now it will rotate from here. When the rover was at about 45 degrees, something else happened. There is a cable in the center here that finally tightened. This tugged on several pulleys, which rotate to release 2 pins, which have been keeping the rover folded. Due to the powerful torsion springs, both sides of the chassis will now try to unfold. Nothing is holding the aft chassis back, so it will unfold first. These wheels are spring-loaded. They want to rotate outwards, but they are held in place by the wheel struts. Inside of here, there are pins holding the struts in place. As the aft chassis unfolds, it tightens the cables inside here, which pulls the pins out. This releases the struts, and the wheels can unfold. This motion happened very quickly. Then locking pins make sure that it stayed in place. For the forward chassis unfolding, this happened much slower. This area at the end of the support arm is called the walking hinge. As the rover kept rotating, this piece forced the lever down, which freed the latch to rotate. This lowered the rover even more. The aft wheels touched the ground, and the rover continued to straighten out, lifting off the latch in the center. The saddle supported the weight at the front of the lunar rover. Once the chassis was almost done unfolding, the 2 front wheels will spring into place. It's the same process that we saw with the aft wheels. 2 more cables tightened, pulling the pins, releasing the struts, and the wheels unfold. The astronauts then released the 2 guide cables. Remember how there were 2 operating tapes? We've only been using the right side, but now it was time to pull on the left side. This released tension on the center guide cable, which allowed the saddle to finish the job and completely lower the rover to the ground. The cable was then pulled to release the saddle assembly. There was a little bit of cleanup work, detaching parts that were no longer needed. The rover was then picked up by hand and moved away from the LEM. Remember, they can lift it because the moon has a lot less gravity. The tripods in the front were removed. This is what supported most of the weight when it was folded up. Then they unfolded the seats, footrests at the front, and the center console. The rover was driven to the other side of the LEM where equipment was installed. The first thing they installed was from Quadrant 3. This is the aft chassis pallet. This is where they stored most of their tools. Then from Quadrant 4 in MESA, we've got the Lunar Communications Relay Unit. high gain antenna and low gain antenna, a holder for the 16mm camera, and a TV camera. Then the astronauts climbed on board. The commander was in the left seat. He's the one that would drive. Then they fastened their seatbelts and explored the moon. The last job of the lunar rover was to use the camera to film our 2 astronauts as they left the surface. This camera was controlled by an operator back on Earth in mission control. Because it takes just over 1 second for signals to reach the moon, it was difficult to move the camera up at just the right time. On the last mission, they finally captured the entire liftoff. For its time, this was incredible quality for a TV broadcast. The lessons learned from the lunar rovers helped to build future programs like the robotic rovers that were sent to Mars. Today, NASA is returning to the moon and building modern lunar terrain vehicles, planned to be used early next decade. These will be much more advanced and stay on the surface much longer. And it all started more than 50 years ago, with 3 lunar rovers just like this one that are quietly still resting on the surface of the moon.